Were a verbal communication to come to us from a person at a distance, there are two ways in which we might try to satisfy ourselves that this was a true communication and that there was no imposition in the affair. We might either sit in examination upon the substance of the message, and then, from what we know of the person from whom it professed to come, judge whether it was probable that such a message would be sent by him, or we may sit in examination upon the credibility of the messengers. It is evident that in carrying on the first examination, we might be subject to very great uncertainty. The professed author of the communication in question may live at such a distance from us that we may never have it in our power to verify his message by any personal conversation with him. We may be so far ignorant of his character and designs as to be unqualified to judge of the kind of communication that should proceed from him. To estimate aright the probable genuineness of the message from what we know of its author would require an acquaintance with his plans and views and circumstances of which we may not be in possession. We may bring the greatest degree of sagacity to this investigation, but then the highest sagacity is of no avail when there is an insufficiency of data. Our ingenuity may be unbounded, but then we may want the materials. The principle which we assume may be untrue in itself, and therefore may be fallacious in its application. Thus, we may derive very little light from our first argument. But there is still a second in reserve, the credibility of the messengers. We may be no judges of the kind of communication which is natural, or likely to proceed from a person with whom we are but imperfectly acquainted, but we may be very competent judges of the degree of faith that is to be reposed in the bearers of that communication. We may know and appreciate the natural signs of veracity. There is a tone and a manner characteristic of honesty, which may be both intelligible and convincing. There may be a concurrence of several messengers. There may be their substantial agreement. There may be the total want of anything like concert or collusion among them. There may be their determined and unanimous perseverance in spite of all the incredulity and all the opposition which they meet with. The subject of the communication may be most unpalatable to us, and we may be so unreasonable as to wreak our unpleasant feelings upon the bearers of it. In this way, they may not only have no earthly interest to deceive us, but have the strongest inducement possible to abstain from insisting upon that message which they were charged to deliver. Last of all, as the conclusive seal of their authenticity, they may all agree in giving us a watchword, which we previously knew could be given by none but their master, and which none but his messengers could ever obtain the possession of. In this way, unfruitful as all our efforts may have been upon the first subject of examination, we may derive from the second the most decisive evidence that the message in question is a real message and was actually transmitted to us by its professed author. Now, this consideration applies in all its parts to a message from God. The argument for the truth of this message resolves itself into the same two topics of examination. We may sit in judgment upon the subject of the message, or we may sit in judgment upon the credibility of its bearers. The first forms a part at least of that argument for the truth of the Christian religion which comes under the head of its internal evidences. The substance of the message is neither more nor less than that particular scheme of the divine economy which is revealed to us in the New Testament. And the point of inquiry is whether this scheme be consistent with the knowledge of God and his attributes which we are previously in possession of. It is doubtful to many whether any effectual argument can be founded upon this consideration, because they do not count themselves enough acquainted with the designs or character of the being from whom the message professes to have come. Were the author of the message some distant and unknown individual of our own species, we would scarcely be entitled to found an argument upon any comparison of ours betwixt the import of the message and the character of the individual, even though we had our general experience of human nature to help us in the speculation. Now, of the invisible God, they affirm that we have no experience whatever. We are still further removed from all direct and personal observation of him or of his counsels. Whether we think of the eternity of his government or the mighty range of its influence over the wide departments of nature and of providence, he stands at such a distance from us as to make the management of his empire a subject well nigh inaccessible to all our faculties. It is evident, however, that this does not apply to the second topic of examination. The bearers of the message were beings like ourselves, and we can apply our safe and certain experience of man to their conduct and their testimony. We may know too little of God to found any confident argument a priori upon the coincidence which we conceive to exist between the subject of the message and our previous conceptions of its author. But we may know enough of man to pronounce upon the credibility of the messengers. Had they the manner and physiognomy of honest men? Was their testimony resisted, and did they persevere in it? Had they any interest in fabricating the message, or did they suffer in consequence of this perseverance? Did they suffer to such a degree as to constitute a satisfying pledge of their integrity? Was there more than one messenger, and did they agree as to the substance of that communication which they made to the world? Did they exhibit any special mark of their office as the messengers of God, such a mark as none but God could give, and none but his approved messengers could obtain the possession of? Was this mark the power of working miracles? And were these miracles so obviously addressed to the senses as to leave no suspicion of deceit behind them? These are questions which we feel our competency to take up and to decide upon. They lie within the legitimate boundaries of human observation, and upon the solution of these do we at present rest the question of the truth of the Christian religion. This, then, is the state of the question with those to whom the message was originally addressed. They had personal access to the messengers, and the evidences of their veracity lay before them. They were the eye and ear witnesses of those facts which occurred at the commencement of the Christian religion, and upon which its credibility rests. What met their observation must have been enough to satisfy them. But we live at the distance of nearly 2,000 years, and is there enough to satisfy us? Those facts which constitute the evidence for Christianity might have been credible and convincing to them if they really saw them, but is there any way by which they can be rendered credible and convincing to us, who only read of them? What is the expedient by which the knowledge and belief of the men of other times can be transmitted to posterity? Can we distinguish between a corrupt and a faithful transmission? Have we evidence before us by which we can ascertain what was the belief of those to whom the message was first communicated? And can the belief which existed in their minds be derived to ours by our sitting in judgment upon the reasons which produced it? The surest way in which the belief and knowledge of the men of former ages can be transmitted to their descendants is through the medium of written testimony, and it is fortunate for us that the records of the Christian religion are not the only historical documents which have come down to us. A great variety of information has come down to us in this way, and a great part of that information is as firmly believed and as confidently proceeded upon as if the thing narrated had happened within the limits of our eyesight. No man doubts the invasion of Britain by Julius Caesar, and no man doubts, therefore, that a conviction of the truth of past events may be fairly produced in the mind by the instrumentality of a written memorial. This is the kind of evidence which is chiefly appealed to for the truth of ancient history, and it is counted satisfying evidence for all that part of it which is received and depended upon. In laying before the reader, then, the evidence for the truth of Christianity, we do not call his mind to any singular or unprecedented exercise of its faculties. We call him to pronounce upon the credibility of written documents which profess to have been published at a certain age and by certain authors. The inquiry involves in it no principle which is not appealed to every day in questions of ordinary criticism. To sit in judgment on the credibility of a written document is a frequent and familiar exercise of the understanding with literary men. It is fortunate for the human mind, when so interesting a question as its religious faith can be placed under the tribunal of such evidence as it is competent to pronounce upon. It was fortunate for those to whom Christianity, a professed communication from heaven, was first addressed, that they could decide upon the genuineness of the communication by such familiar and everyday principles as the marks of truth or falsehood in the human bearers of that communication. And it is fortunate for us that when, after that communication has assumed the form of a historical document, we can pronounce upon the degree of credit which should be attached to it by the very same exercise of mind which we so confidently engage in when sitting in examination upon the other historical documents that have come down to us from antiquity. If two historical documents possess equal degrees of evidence, they should produce equal degrees of conviction. But if the object of the one be to establish some fact connected with our religious faith, while the object of the other is to establish some fact about which we feel no other interest than that general curiosity which is gratified by the solution of any question in literature, this difference in the object produces a difference of effect in the feelings and tendencies of the mind. It is impossible for the mind, while it inquires into the evidence of a Christian document, to abstain from all reference to the important conclusion of the inquiry. And this will necessarily mingle its influence with the arguments which engage its attention. It may be of importance to attend to the peculiar feelings which are thus given to the investigation, and in how far they have affected the impression of the Christian argument. We know it to be the opinion of some that in this way an undue advantage has been given to that argument. Instead of a pure question of truth, it has been made a question of sentiment, and the wishes of the heart have mingled with the exercises of the understanding. There is a class of men who may feel disposed to overrate its evidences because they are anxious to give every support and stability to a system which they conceive to be most intimately connected with the dearest hopes and wishes of humanity. Because their imagination is carried away by the sublimity of its doctrines, or their heart engaged by that amiable morality which is so much calculated to improve and adorn the face of society. Now, we are ready to admit that as the object of the inquiry is not the character but the truth of Christianity, the philosopher should be careful to protect his mind from the delusion of its charms. He should separate the exercises of the understanding from the tendencies of the fancy or of the heart. He should be prepared to follow the light of evidence, though it may lead him to conclusions the most painful and melancholy. He should train his mind to all the hardihood of abstract and unfeeling intelligence. He should give up everything to the supremacy of argument, and be able to renounce, without a sigh, all the tenderest prepossessions of infancy, the moment that truth demands of him the sacrifice. Let it be remembered, however, that while one species of prejudice operates in favor of Christianity, another prejudice operates against it. There is a class of men who are repelled from the investigation of its evidences because in their minds Christianity is allied with the weakness of superstition, and they feel that they are descending when they bring down their attention to a subject which engrosses so much respect and admiration from the vulgar. It appears to us that the peculiar feeling which the sacredness of the subject gives to the inquirer is, upon the whole, unfavorable to the impression of the Christian argument. Had the subject not been sacred, and had the same testimony been given to the facts that are connected with it, we are satisfied that the history of Jesus in the New Testament would have been looked upon as the best supported by evidence of any history that has come down to us. It would assist us in appreciating the evidence for the truth of the gospel history if we could conceive for a moment that Jesus, instead of being the founder of a new religion, had been merely the founder of a new school of philosophy, and that the different histories which have come down to us had merely represented him as an extraordinary person who had rendered himself illustrious among his countrymen by the wisdom of his sayings and the beneficence of his actions. We venture to say that had this been the case, a tenth part of the testimony which has actually been given would have been enough to satisfy us. Had it been a question of mere erudition, where neither a predilection in favor of a religion nor an antipathy against it could have impressed a bias in any one direction, the testimony, both in weight and in quantity, would have been looked upon as quite unexampled in the whole compass of ancient literature. To form a fair estimate of the strength and decisiveness of the Christian argument, we should, if possible, divest ourselves of all reference to religion and view the truth of the gospel history purely as a question of erudition. If at the outset of the investigation we have a prejudice against the Christian religion, the effect is obvious, and without any refinement of explanation, we see at once how such a prejudice must dispose us to annex suspicion and distrust to the testimony of the Christian writers. But even when the prejudice is on the side of Christianity, the effect is unfavorable on a mind that is at all scrupulous about the rectitude of its opinions. In these circumstances, the mind gets suspicious of itself. It feels a predilection and becomes apprehensive lest this predilection may have disposed it to cherish a particular conclusion independently of the evidences by which it is supported. Were it a mere speculative question, in which the interests of man and the attachments of his heart had no share, he would feel greater confidence in the result of his investigation. But it is difficult to separate the moral impressions of piety, and it is no less difficult to calculate their precise influence on the exercises of the understanding. In the complex sentiment of attachment and conviction, which he annexes to the Christian religion, he finds it difficult to say how much is due to the tendencies of the heart and how much is due to the pure and unmingled influence of argument. His very anxiety for the truth disposes him to overrate the circumstances which give a bias to his understanding. And, through the whole process of the inquiry, he feels a suspicion and an embarrassment which he would not have felt had it been a question of ordinary erudition. The same suspicion which he attaches to himself, he will be ready to attach to all whom he conceives to be in similar circumstances. Now, every author who writes in defense of Christianity is supposed to be a Christian, and this, in spite of every argument to the contrary, has the actual effect of weakening the impression of his testimony. The suspicion affects, in a more remarkable degree, the testimony of the first writers on the side of Christianity. In opposition to it, you have no doubt to allege the circumstances under which the testimony was given, the tone of sincerity which runs through the performance of the author, the concurrence of other testimonies, the persecutions which were sustained in adhering to them, and which can be accounted for on no other principle than the power of conscience and conviction, and the utter impossibility of imposing a false testimony on the world, had they even been disposed to do it. Still, there is a lurking suspicion which often survives all this strength of argument, and which it is difficult to get rid of, even after it has been demonstrated to be completely unreasonable. He is a Christian. He is one of the party. Am I an infidel? I persist in distrusting the testimony. Am I a Christian? I rejoice in the strength of it. But this very joy becomes matter of suspicion to a scrupulous inquirer. He feels something more than the concurrence of his belief in the testimony of the writer. He catches the infection of his piety and his moral sentiments. In addition to the acquiescence of the understanding, there is a con amore feeling, both in himself and in its author, which he had rather be without, because he finds it difficult to compute the precise amount of its influence. And the consideration of this restrains him from that clear and decided conclusion, which he would infallibly have landed in, had it been purely a secular investigation. There is something in the very sacredness of the subject which intimidates the understanding and restrains it from making the same firm and confident application of its faculties which it would have felt itself perfectly warranted to do had it been a question of ordinary history. Had the apostles been the disciples of some eminent philosopher, and the fathers of the Church their immediate successors in the office of presiding over the discipline and instruction of the numerous schools which they had established, this would have given a secular complexion to the argument, which, we think, would have been more satisfying to the mind, and have impressed upon it a closer and more familiar conviction of the history in question. We should have immediately brought it into comparison with the history of other philosophers, and could not have failed to recognize that, in minuteness of information, in weight and quantity of evidence, in the concurrence of numerous and independent testimonies, and in the total absence of every circumstance that should dispose us to annex suspicion to the account which lay before us, it far surpassed anything that had come down to us from antiquity. It so happens, however, that instead of being the history of a philosopher, it is the history of a prophet. The veneration we annex to the sacredness of such a character mingles with our belief in the truth of his history. From a question of simple truth, it becomes a question in which the heart is interested, and the subject from that moment assumes a certain holiness and mystery which veils the strength of the argument and takes off from that familiar and intimate conviction which we annex to the far less authenticated histories of profane authors. It may be further observed that every part of the Christian argument has been made to undergo a most severe scrutiny. The same degree of evidence which, in questions of ordinary history, commands the easy and universal acquiescence of every inquirer, has, in the subject before us, been taken most thoroughly to pieces and pursued both by friends and enemies into all its ramifications. The effect of this is unquestionable. The genuineness and authenticity of the profane historian are admitted upon much inferior evidence to what we can adduce for the different pieces which make up the New Testament. And why? Because the evidence has been hitherto thought sufficient, and the genuineness and authenticity have never been questioned. Not so with the gospel history. Though its evidence is precisely the same in kind and vastly superior in degree to the evidence for the history of the profane writer, its evidence has been questioned, and the very circumstance of its being questioned has annexed a suspicion to it. At all points of the question, there has been a struggle and a controversy. Every ignorant objection and every rash and petulant observation has been taken up and commented upon by the defenders of Christianity. There has at last been so much said about it that a general feeling of insecurity is apt to accompany the whole investigation. There has been so much fighting that Christianity is now looked upon as debatable ground. Other books, where the evidence is much inferior, but which have had the advantage of never being questioned, are received as of established authority. It is striking to observe the perfect confidence with which an infidel will quote a passage from an ancient historian. He perhaps does not overrate the credit due to him, but present him with a tabulated and comparative view of all the evidences that can be adduced for the Gospel of Matthew, and any profane historian whom he chooses to fix upon, and let each distinct evidence be discussed upon no other principle than the ordinary and approved principles of criticism, we assure him that the sacred history would far outweigh the profane in the number and value of its testimonies. In illustration of the above remarks, we can refer to the experience of those who have attended to this examination. We ask them to recollect the satisfaction which they felt when they came to those parts of the examination where the argument assumes a secular complexion. Let us take the testimony of Tacitus for an example. He asserts the execution of our Saviour in the reign Tiberius and under the procuratorship of Pilate. The temporary check which this gave to his religion, its revival, and the progress it had made not only over Judea, but to the city of Rome. Now all this is attested in the annals of Tacitus. But it is also attested in a far more direct and circumstantial manner in the annals of another author, in a book entitled The History of the Acts of the Apostles by the evangelist Luke. Both of these performances carry, on the very face of them, the appearance of unsuspicious and well-authenticated documents. But there are several circumstances in which the testimony of Luke possesses a decided advantage over the testimony of Tacitus. He was the companion of these very apostles. He was an eyewitness to many of the events recorded by him. He had the advantage over the Roman historian in time and in place, and in personal knowledge of many of the circumstances in his history. The genuineness of his publication, too, and the time of its appearance are far better established, and by precisely that kind of argument which is held decisive in every other question of erudition. Besides all this, we have the testimony of at least 5 of the Christian fathers, all of whom had the same or a greater advantage in point of time than Tacitus, and who had a much nearer and readier access to original sources of information. Now, how comes it that the testimony of Tacitus, a distant and later historian, should yield such delight and satisfaction to the inquirer, while all the antecedent testimony, which, by every principle of approved criticism, is much stronger than the other, should produce an impression that is comparatively languid and ineffectual. It is owing, in a great measure, to the principle to which we have already alluded. There is a sacredness annexed to the subject, so long as it is under the pen of fathers and evangelists, and this very sacredness takes away from the freedom and confidence of the argument. The moment that it is taken up by a profane author, the spell which held the understanding in some degree of restraint is dissipated. We now tread on the more familiar ground of ordinary history, and the evidence for the truth of the gospel appears more assimilated to that evidence, which brings home to our conviction the particulars of the Greek and Roman story. To say that Tacitus was upon this subject a disinterested historian is not enough to explain the preference which you give to his testimony. There is no subject in which the triumph of the Christian argument is more conspicuous than the moral qualifications which give credit to the testimony of its witnesses. We have every possible evidence that there could be neither mistake nor falsehood in their testimony. A much greater quantity of evidence, indeed, than can actually be produced to establish the credibility of any other historian. Now, all we ask is that where an exception to the veracity of any historian is removed, you restore him to that degree of credit and influence which he ought to have possessed had no such exception been made. In no case has an exception to the credibility of an author been more triumphantly removed than in the case of the early Christian writers. And yet, as a proof that there really exists some such delusion as we have been laboring to demonstrate, though our eyes are perfectly open to the integrity of the Christian witnesses, there is still a disposition to give the preference to the secular historian. When Tacitus is placed by the side of the evangelist Luke, even after the decisive argument which establishes the credit of the latter historian has convinced the understanding, there remains a tendency in the mind to annex a confidence to the account of the Roman writer which is altogether disproportioned to the relative merits of his testimony. Let us suppose, for the sake of farther illustration, that Tacitus had included some more particulars in his testimony, and that, in addition to the execution of our Saviour, he had asserted, in round and unqualified terms, that this said Christus had risen from the dead and was seen alive by some hundreds of his acquaintances. Even this would not have silenced altogether the cavils of enemies, but it would have reclaimed many an infidel, been exulted in by many a sincere Christian, and made to occupy a foremost place in many a book upon the evidences of our religion. Are we to forget all the while that we are in actual possession of much stronger testimony? That we have the concurrence of 8 or 10 contemporary authors, most of whom had actually seen Christ after the great event of his resurrection? That the veracity of these authors and the genuineness of their respective publications are established on grounds much stronger than have ever been alleged in behalf of Tacitus or any ancient author? Whence this unaccountable preference of Tacitus? Upon every received principle of criticism, we are bound to annex greater confidence to the testimony of the apostles. It is vain to recur to the imputation of its being an interested testimony. This the apologists for Christianity undertake to disprove, and actually have disproved it, and that by a much greater quantity of evidence than would be held perfectly decisive in a question of common history. If, after this, there should remain any lurking sentiment of diffidence or suspicion, it is entirely resolvable into some such principle as I have already alluded to. It is to be treated as a mere feeling, a delusion which should not be admitted to have any influence on the convictions of the understanding. The principle which we have been attempting to expose is found, in fact, to run through every part of the argument and to accompany the inquirer through all the branches of the investigation. The genuineness of the different books of the New Testament forms a very important inquiry, wherein the object of the Christian apologist is to prove that they were really written by their professed authors. In proof of this, there is an uninterrupted series of testimony from the days of the apostles, and it was not to be expected that a point so esoteric to the Christian society could have attracted the attention of profane authors till the religion of Jesus, by its progress in the world, had rendered itself conspicuous. It is not, then, till about 80 years after the publication of the different pieces that we meet with the testimony of Celsus, an avowed enemy to Christianity, and who asserts, upon the strength of its general notoriety, that the historical parts of the New Testament were written by the disciples of our Saviour. This is very decisive evidence. But how does it happen that it should throw a clearer gleam of light and satisfaction over the mind of the inquirer than he had yet experienced in the whole train of his investigation? Whence that disposition to underrate the antecedent testimony of the Christian writers? Talk not of theirs being an interested testimony, for, in point of fact, the same disposition operates after reason is convinced that the suspicion is totally unfounded. What we contend for is that this indifference to the testimony of the Christian writers implies a dereliction of principles, which we apply with the utmost confidence to all similar inquiries. The effects of this same principle are perfectly discernible in the writings of even our most judicious apologists. We offer no reflection against the assiduous Lardner, who, in his credibility of the gospel history, presents us with a collection of testimonies which should make every Christian proud of his religion. In his evidence for the genuineness of the different pieces which make up the New Testament, he begins with the oldest of the fathers, some of whom were the intimate companions of the original writers. According to our view of the matter, he should have dated the commencement of his argument from a higher point, and begun with the testimonies of these original writers to one another. In the second epistle of Peter, there is a distinct reference made to the writings of Paul. And in the Acts of the Apostles, there is a reference made to one of the four Gospels. Had Peter, instead of being an apostle, ranked only with the fathers of the church, and had his epistle not been admitted into the canon of Scripture, this testimony of his would have had a place in the catalogue and been counted peculiarly valuable, both for its precision and its antiquity. There is certainly nothing in the estimation he enjoyed, or in the circumstances of his epistle being bound up with the other books of the New Testament, which ought to impair the credit of his testimony. But, in effect, his testimony does make a weaker impression on the mind than a similar testimony from Barnabas or Clement or Polycarp. It certainly ought not to do it, and there is a delusion in the preference that is thus given to the later writers. It is, in fact, another example of the principle which we have been so often insisting upon. What profane authors are in reference to Christian authors at large, the fathers of the Church are in reference to the original writers of the New Testament. The contradiction to every approved principle, we prefer the distant and the later testimony to the testimony of writers who carry as much evidence and legitimate authority along with them, and who only differ from others in being nearer the original sources of information. We neglect and undervalue the evidence which the New Testament itself furnishes, and rest the whole of the argument upon the external and superinduced testimony of subsequent authors. A great deal of all this is owing to the manner in which the defense of Christianity has been conducted by its friends and supporters. They have given too much into the suspicions of the opposite party. They have yielded their minds to the infection of their skepticism, and maintained through the whole process a caution and a delicacy which they often carry to a degree that is excessive, and by which, in fact, they have done injustice to their own arguments. Some of them begin with the testimony of Tacitus as a first principle, and pursue the investigation upwards, as if the evidence that we collect from the annals of the Roman historian were stronger than that of the Christian writers, who flourished nearer the scene of the investigation, and whose credibility can be established on grounds which are altogether independent of his testimony. In this way, they come at last to the credibility of the New Testament writers, but by a lengthened and circuitous procedure. The reader feels as if the argument were diluted at every step in the process of derivation, and his faith in the gospel history is much weaker than his faith in histories that are far less authenticated. Bring Tacitus and the New Testament to an immediate comparison, and subject them both to the touchstone of ordinary and received principles, and it will be found that the latter leaves the former out of sight in all the marks and characters and evidences of an authentic history. The truth of the gospel stands on a much firmer and more independent footing than many of its defenders would dare to give any conception of. They want that boldness of argument which the merits of the question entitle them to assume. They ought to maintain a more decided front to their adversaries, and tell them that in the New Testament itself, in the concurrence of its numerous and distinct and independent authors, in the uncontradicted authority which it has maintained from the earliest times of the Church, in the total inability of the bitterest adversaries of our religion to impeach its credibility, in the genuine characters of honesty and fairness which it carries on the very face of it, that in these and in everything else which can give validity to the written history of past times, there is a weight and a splendor of evidence which the testimony of Tacitus cannot confirm, and which the absence of that testimony could not have diminished. If it were necessary in a court of justice to ascertain the circumstances of a certain transaction which happened in a particular neighborhood, the obvious expedient would be to examine the agents and the eyewitnesses of that transaction. If 6 or 8 concurred in giving the same testimony, if there was no appearance of collusion amongst them, if they had the manner and aspect of creditable men, above all, if this testimony were made public, and not a single individual from the numerous spectators of the transaction alluded to stepped forward to falsify it, then, we apprehend, the proof would be looked upon as complete. Other witnesses might be summoned from the distance to give in their testimony, not of what they saw, but of what they heard upon the subject. But their concurrence, though a happy enough circumstance, would never be looked upon as any material addition to the evidence already brought forward. Another court of justice might be held in a distant country, and, years after the death of the original witnesses, it might have occasion to verify the same transaction, and for this purpose might call in the only evidence which it was capable of collecting: the testimony of men who lived after the transaction in question, and at a great distance from the place where it happened. There would be no hesitation in ordinary cases about the relative value of the two testimonies, and the records of the first court would be appealed to by posterity as by far the more valuable document, and far more decisive of the point in controversy. Now, what we complain of is that in the instance before us this principle is reversed. The report of hearsay witnesses is held in higher estimation than the report of the original agents and spectators. The most implicit credit is given to the testimony of the distant and later historians, and the testimony of the original witnesses is received with as much distrust as if they carried the marks of villainy and imposture upon their foreheads. The authenticity of the first record can be established by a much greater weight and variety of evidence than the authenticity of the second. Yet all the suspicion that we feel upon this subject annexes to the former. And the apostles and evangelists, with every evidence in their favor which it is in the power of testimony to furnish, are in fact degraded from the place which they ought to occupy among the accredited historians of past times. The above observations may help to prepare the inquirer for forming a just and impartial estimate of the merits of the Christian testimony. His great object should be to guard against every bias of the understanding. The general idea is that a predilection in favor of Christianity may lead him to overrate the argument. We believe that if every unfair tendency of the mind could be subjected to a rigorous computation, it would be found that the combined operation of them all has the effect of impressing a bias in a contrary direction. All we wish for is that the arguments which are held decisive in other historical questions should not be looked upon as nugatory when applied to the investigation of those facts which are connected with the truth and establishment of the Christian religion. That every prepossession should be swept away and room left for the understanding to expatiate without fear and without encumbrance.